So let's talk about big data, right? Although I'm actually not going to do so much of the computational side of it today. We'll talk about it a little bit. I want to start with this, which is a blog I used to keep for, you can see it goes back to '98, and I still do some of this kind of stuff in Facebook, just very personal stories to myself about the past, right? And if you think about it, a lot of the stuff that you put online, right, says something about you. The email that comes into you, your Twitter statuses, your tweets, your photos, blogs, whatever else, is sort of this enormous amount of information that's going out there. And I don't want to sort of pound on the big data story because we all kind of know this, but the first point I want to make is that because of these interfaces, right, they focus on now and fresh because they're about updating people's awareness and because adding new content recruits people to come back to your site more and more. And so these interfaces tend to focus on the now, and then the data goes away to be mined by our robot overlords, right? What both companies and researchers actually have kind of realized this. And so there's this perspective on big data that I call big data as a window, where basically, although you can't actually see, I can't directly know things about you, the data that you put online is like a little window into your soul, right? And depending on what part of your soul I'm interested in, I might be a company who wants to do recommender systems, right? Whether I want to sell you things, or like in this tool, which I wrote back in the day called SuggestBot, which is a recommender system for Wikipedia. What it does is it takes the things that you've edited in the past, looks for things in Wikipedia that are marked as needing work and that are related to what you've worked on before, and tries to help you find things that you're going to have fun working on, meanwhile helping Wikipedia become a better system, right? So by modeling your preferences and interests, I can do interesting recommendations, and I can make the system smarter, right? Which may have good for the company, may have good for the organization, may have good for the individual. And I've done a fair amount of this work in the past, and I've got some more work ongoing around recommender systems in Facebook. But I don't want to focus on this work, right? This is not the goal of today's talk. The other side of the perspective of the big data as a window perspective is kind of the researcher side, right? Social scientists, computer science people, physics people realized that, oh, hey, these data let us see human behavior on a scale that's been really hard to attack before. And so this graph was done by a couple of people at Cornell, Michael Macy and Scott Golder. This is 500 million tweets, I think, broken down, aggregated by hour, aggregated by continent, and then analyzed to see how much positive affect and how much negative affect were in the language of the tweet, right? And so this analysis is trying to figure out something about happiness in the world over time, right? And a lot of the kinds of big data analysis you see are like this, right? They'll take some chunk of data, they'll break it down in some kind of computationally tractable way, and hopefully come out with something that tells you interesting stories about the world. Now, you can wonder how interesting or how believable the stories are, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is a kind of work that's ultra super popular these days, right? There are giant NSF programs that are just raining down money on big data people. And so a lot of people do this kind of social science, sociological, psychological, analytical work. I also have done some of this kind of work in the past with people at Cornell for whom this is kind of a major way they approach the world. But this is also not what I want to talk about, because I want to go back to the fact that the data is about me, and think about these big data, these kind of social traces, as a mirror. What could I do with these data to help people understand themselves better? Because the stuff that you put online tends to be, not always, right? There are plenty of people who are just like, I ate lunch, now I ate more lunch, now I'm driving down the freeway, now I'm eating dinner, right? And more me-formers. But on average, people sort of capture interesting data about themselves that might help you tell important stories. And this is an area in HCI and CSCW and persuasive computing and kind of health technologies that's starting to get some traction, right? Trying to take this big data story, but at the level of the individual. Tracking and capturing personal data about food consumption or steps taken or exercise or sleep habits to try to come up with representations that'll help you better understand. So this is a chart that shows you what times of day you're most likely to exercise, right, based on kind of fitness tracking stuff. Or like Gordon Bell and Abigail Stone and Sean Lindley and others, they're thinking about what would happen if you took a device like the SenseCam, which is basically a camera you wear around your neck and it takes pictures every 30 seconds. What would our lives be like if we had that kind of archive? What kind of computational tools would you need to manage it? What kinds of things would you ask it? How would people make sense of it, right? And there are other stories, so like Judith Doneth and Fernanda Villegas and Kara Halios have done sort of visualizations of the communication archives that people have, looking at patterns of your email use or group discussion chats over time, right? So this idea of taking big data and reflecting it back to people for their consideration is not really new, but it's something that I'm particularly interested in because I'm afraid it gets a little lost in sort of the storm of the social science big data approach. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to talk a little bit, I don't want this to become a let's talk in great detail about Dan Cosley's work story, right? So I'm going to be eliding some details from the talk with the goal of instead making 3 big points using 3 of the studies that we've done in this space. One is that it's kind of interesting to support reflection or at least reminiscence using these tools. It's a very interesting, practical, and worthwhile thing to do. 2, that when you start doing this and you look at how people actually use these data to reflect on things, it turns out that a lot of the assumptions that you make in quantified self-land about the value of sort of graphs and aggregation are hard because most people aren't actually trained to read graphs. Then instead they tend to focus on particular instances. And so if you want to help people think about these patterns, right, these sort of larger scale insights, we need to sort of provide support that's going to be really effective for the ways individuals think about data. And then the third thing is that we're going to take a brief look at just how complicated the decisions about whether to put something on Facebook are and make an argument about what this means for kind of stories about big data of the form, well, if we just build a big enough model, we'll understand all human behavior and we don't really need to reference old theories or old models or old simplifications around this because we won't need them because it'll just show up in the data, right? And we have people here who are finding, hey, it's actually hard to just even pull events out of a Twitter stream. I mean, it's not impossible to do it, but it's hard. And this is just something happened, right? Why it happened, what caused it to happen, things like that are kinds of things that sometimes you hear as a rhetoric of big data. And although I'm really sympathetic to that, there's some dangers too, and I'll have a couple of prescriptions maybe for how we can think about that. And then at the end, if there's time and energy, I'll sort of pontificate a little bit. I'm old enough in my career now that I'm allowed to try to do that, right? And then you can believe me or not. You should feel free to stop and ask questions at any time, right? I'm happy with the interactive thing. Plus that part, people have this tendency when they're going to a talk, you come up with a question, and then all you're thinking about is the question, the question, the question. I mean, one answer to that is write it down, right? But if you have a question, just, okay? Yes?
I'm not familiar with that Tennessee. Was that a new term?
It is, well, so are you Harry Potter? How many Harry Potter fans? Right, so this was a magical artifact in the Harry Potter universe, and I will talk about my not quite as magical version of it in a second. All right. So we're going to start with how social media data might support reflection, and in particular support reminiscence. Right? Because the reason I started keeping that blog back in the day was that I'm terrible at remembering the past, and when I do, I usually only remember the bad things. And my ex-wife made a lot of fun of me for it, so I started writing these things down, right? And it turns out that reminiscing, although we think about it as something that's sort of more associated with older folks, it's in fact something we do all the time, right? We smell something or see something and suddenly we're thinking about an event that happened 15 years ago. And this thinking is actually valuable, right? It can be pleasant in its own right. It can be stuff that's relevant to what we're doing today, right? So you might think about the past to help you solve problems. You might reminisce together with people to build social bonds, or reminisce about them to keep those social bonds alive when they're not there, right? So reminiscing is actually this kind of multi-purpose, cognitive knife that we wield to do lots of useful things. And so I thought it would be really cool to study. And again, just like the story that, big data isn't like, the panacea for everything, it's not totally original to me. There have been lots of other people who have studied reminiscing in HCI. So for instance, this thing is an artifact called the FM or radio, the Family Memories Radio, that was developed by Petrelli and a few other people a few years ago at CHI, where they were like, oh, sounds are important. So let's capture sound in the home and then try to give people creative, engaging ways to re-experience those sounds and sort of make memories that way. Or this little doodad is called the Living Memory Box. This was built at Georgia Tech back in like 2003, and the idea is that you have a physical memento that reminds you of something, right, that you got on a trip or as a present, a tchotchke, and you'd want to be able to pass it down someday, but of course the story about why it's important is all in your head, so why not put it into the living memory box and then record some, well, I mean, one could say stories or metadata, depending on what one's take on the world was, but record, some history about the object that would go with it that would help you or people who knew you or your speaker for the dead later after, at your funeral, right, or your children sort of understand the things that you have, right? And so, and I'm a big fan of technology, and one day, I was looking at my blog, and I realized I never read it except once a year when I changed it from diary to diary 1998 and cleaned it out. And so eventually I was like, oh, well, what I could do is I could have my computer read my blog for me, right, and parse it, and then send me pieces of it to force me to engage with it. And I chose the most disruptive way I could think of to get memories sent to me, which was text messages. Now, right, you've seen people who get text messages, and no matter what they're doing, out comes the phone, right? And if any of you do that during this talk, I'll kill you. Throw a bullet. I will throw a basketball at them, yes, and then you can fire me from the talk. And so I wrote a program to do this and send me text messages. Right? This is one that actually came from an internship that I had 12 years ago down in Princeton with NEC. I was like, oh, hey, I remember. And I remember actually sitting in the restaurant when I wrote that diary entry. And I was like, oh, yeah. And then I remembered Steve Lawrence, the guy I was working with, and I remember my wife and seeing her. And so it sent this kind of nice set of memories towards me. And, I showed this to people, and they thought it was interesting. And so we thought about, well, how can we generalize this beyond Dan Cosley's blog, and we had this big decision about what were the right tools, right? And as I said, CHI researchers tend to focus on having a new technology associated with it because we value thingies, right? The community values artifacts and novelty and interaction styles. The problem with it is that it turns reminiscing from this kind of spontaneous activity that we talked about into this sort of planned thing. And although, Grandpa sits down with the kids with a photo album, that's also a planned kind of reminiscing. We wanted to really try to make this sort of fit into everyday life, in the everyday computing sense that they talked about, that Ewout and Meinat talked about at Georgia Tech, where instead of having like a task that you're trying to solve with your technology, you have an ongoing daily activity or an ongoing life activity that just sort of rises up at times, like, communicating with mom or maintaining a shopping list or laundry, right? These kinds of things that are just sort of woven into life rather than, oh, I'm going to do this and finish it and be done. And so our design goals when we built Pensive was to fit existing practices and uses, right? Use tools people are already familiar with, require them to learn almost nothing, and to use, when possible, existing media and content, because people, even in '08 when we were developing this, were saying stories about themselves online that were important, right? No, not everyone tells these stories about themselves online, and so we had another thing that we did. Oh, I'll get to that in a second, sorry. Bad talk timing. I'm going to skip spontaneity and control. I am going to talk about encouraging capture, though, because as we were doing this, we actually had done some interviews with people about their reminiscing practices, not using technology, and pretty much one of the giant themes that came out was, man, I wish I had more stuff from the past. Right? And so we wanted to use existing media, fit existing practices and uses, and encourage people to capture. And so we built something that's technologically really boring, a website that sent email, right? The website is called Pensive. Pensive lets you create an account and then hook your Pensive account up to Twitter or Blogger or Last.fm or Flickr or Picasa. So a range of media and services. We only chose services that we didn't have to remember your passwords for and where the data was publicly accessible to try to reduce possible privacy concerns around this kind of a site. And then we provided a diary where you could write about those media that you had put in the past, right? And the way you were reminded to write about those things was by getting emails. And so Pensive, about once a day, although people could control this more or less, would send you an email that either contained something from one of your social media streams. So this is John Baxter, one of the primary developers of Pensive, right? You know, he did not go viral like Star Wars Boy, but this, you know, this was clearly something from his kind of dorm life that spoke to him, right? And so you might get this. Or if you didn't have very many social media accounts, either because you didn't want to share them with us because you were worried that we would mine your soul, or because you didn't have very much data online, we had these non-personalized prompts, right? And these actually were drawn from an idea from reminiscence therapy, which is actually used in care homes as a sort of tool for caregivers and inhabitants of care homes to sort of interact and encourage them to tell their story. So do you remember the first day of school, or do you remember you know, learning to cook, right? Things that, although they're not you specific, most people will have had those experiences, and they might lead you back to memories of friends or teachers or mom or old homes. This one in particular was a little sad. I actually got it like the day after I went to my first rock concert ever when I was 40. But it was so this didn't always work, right? But on balance, these were pretty evocative prompts for people, as we'll see. And then you could both go to the website to write diary entries about it, or you could just reply to the email. That's okay. That's okay. Or you could just reply to the email. Right? And so basically what we did was we threw this out into the world, a totally uncontrolled study. We deployed a technology, made it available, seeded it with the 12 developers on the team, and they started telling their friends about it. So it was this horrible snowball sample, right? So do not claim, I do not claim that these represent a compendium of human knowledge about the ways all people at all times and all places would react to something like Pensive. But what I will say is that we wound up with a population that was, although it skewed young because it started with a mostly young team, actually had a fair number of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and today, you know, of ages, of various genders, various life stations. About 100 people at the time we did the analysis. And it turns out that basically the highest level thing was, like, is this actually really as cool for other people as it is for me, right? That was my research question, right? And the answer was yes, actually. And people saw this idea of being reminded to reminisce a little more, whether they actually wrote some diary entries or not, or whether it was just the activity of reminiscing. We got some very pointed criticism in our first version of the paper around this, that writing was not the reminiscing, right? That the reminiscing was something that went on in the head, and the data itself was just data, right? And so we started looking both at, you know, the ways people talked about how it affected the reminiscing practice, and also at the actual diary entries that people brought into the site, right? But they described it as valuable, not life-changing, which is perfect because we didn't want it to change people's lives or practices. We just wanted to help them a little bit. And it turned out they actually used it for real reminiscing things, right? They didn't do artificial reminiscing, right? They were thinking about their past. They were using it to connect to people, right? They were thinking, oh, this makes me want to touch base with Debbie, or tell stories about Dad, or work through problems that had happened in the past, right? So basically, by prompting people to think about and reflect on and reminisce about their past, we were encouraging them to reap some of these benefits, right? Now, not all of it was good. So there is triggers can be less meaningful, right? So that one about the rock concert, where the one I went to yesterday, right, not very helpful. If you didn't have an experience that was relevant to one of the non-personalized triggers, not helpful. If you got a picture of this rock with some fungus on it, as one poor person did like 4 times during the study, not helpful, right? And this is actually kind of a research question, right? I mean, we wound up not pursuing it because, as we'll see, the students who were interested in it wound up, looking kind of at reminiscing practice even more deeply and sort of on the more social side. I'm a little weird. I'm more reminisce individually, I think, than most people do. But this question of, if you knew just a little bit about somebody's context, where they are, who they're talking to, as we'll see with this system called Time Hop, what day of the year it is, right? You might be able to be a little smarter about what you picked out of the past to show someone today, right? Pensive, for good or for bad, was very random about this, right? High serendipity, possible low relevance. But you could imagine tuning this to sort of, encourage people to think more deeply about the things that were going on today. I mean, you could probably be very evil about how you chose the things to show people from the past, right? This is the danger of modeling users, is that then you have to figure out what to do with those models. But, this sort of really targeted reflection would be a pretty interesting research question to go after. A second category of things that people were worried about were bad memories, right? Why would you want to remember crappy things, right? I mean, I do it because I'm kind of self-punishing a little bit. But people would complain about this, right? They would say, hey, I don't like. Other people, though, found that it was actually really important to get the bad things, to sort of reprocess them. That they wanted Pensive, not a quote not shown here, but that Pensive kind of forced them to confront things that they had been putting off. So, for instance, super personal story. Sorry, my dad died like 4 months ago, and I still haven't really had a chance yet to sort of sit down and work through it, right? And so something that sort of really pushed me to think through that would actually maybe be really useful, even if it were kind of painful right now. But so this is another question, and you could imagine trying to do research work around this to reduce the impact of that, or give people scaffolding for managing them, or providing help when they find that doing this leads them to a place where they're uncomfortable and they might want help, like that poor basketball coach. So this was a second kind of real limitation issue that came up. The third was that we were a bunch of rich white kids at Cornell who were coming up with these non-personalized prompts, right? And so if you don't have prom in your country, a prompt about prom is not very interesting. And in fact, a couple of people were very explicit about how little they liked that, right? It's this idea of cultural sensitivity, right? Which in principle, as good HCI researchers, we should all know and do in all of our interfaces and systems, and I'm sure you're doing it in all the work that you're doing, is still something, right, that's useful to be reminded about, even if sometimes you're reminded about it by getting punched in the face by it. Yes?
I just had a question about if you found that people were using this as individuals versus using it as groups, because I noticed that you said very briefly that people can reminisce, but also individuals can reminisce also can groups.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if people use this.
So, sad story about that. First of all, we designed it very intentionally for individuals the first time around because of the possible sensitivity of writing something, right? We didn't want stuff to get accidentally shared. We didn't have a very good theory for how we would do access control. And then we saw all the data from the first one about how no matter what the prompt was about, people were reminiscing about people, right? Sunglasses, dad, right? And so we actually built a second version of it. Well, we added social features to it, and then we sort of took inspiration from the Facebook message model, right? Where you get a fixed recipient list for a thread. So, this doesn't prevent information leakage, right? It's awfully easy to copy and paste things, but it helps, right? And in this case, and there's a fuller story about it in the HCI journal article that we wound up, but people wound up not using it, I think, partly because the people who had started with Pensive used it as the individual thing, and so we had shaped their expectations, partly because if you really wanted to do social reminiscing, where would you go to do that? Would you build your own system, or would you put it inside of Facebook? If you were smart, you'd put it inside of Facebook, and if you were dumb, you would put it in your own system and hope that people would adopt it, right? And so, you know, we kind of made I think we made a tactical mistake by that. But this idea of social reminiscing, right, I think is interesting. I think most of the work in Chi is about family reminiscing in particular, right? Very socially oriented, right? That's one of the reasons why Pensive was kind of different and weird, because it really was kind of focused in individuals. So, yeah.
So I have a question about, when do you have an element for the tangible artifacts in the family, for the memory, right? That's everybody knows, and you have a lot of things that, how you actually translate those tangible things that also give you a lot of memory as the first entry point to be in the system.
Yeah, we did not, right? Because to think about good ways to do that, we thought about things like the living memory box and the radio and other things that would require bringing new technologies into it. And there's room for new technologies in reminiscing, but philosophically, we were trying to avoid that, right? And so, you know, you could imagine versions that were like this, right? Like maybe some of the pictures from Flickr could be of tangible objects that you would then talk about. But we left these out, right? We deliberately focused on social media. I think it's only part of the reminiscing story, right? I totally take your point that there's other.
Because I interviewed the families for their family stories, right? They use all kind of like artifacts to tell the story.
Yep.
I was thinking whether the entrance point, you give them elements to describe certain things that's important, heirloom things, like something passed from your grandparents,
Yeah.
things like that. It's a way to remind you.
So we talk about this a little bit in the journal paper as well. Not so much the tangible things per se, but the idea that, you know, there's reminiscing in band and out of band for the system, right? And so the way I would think about in this framework, what you're talking about is that people actually do a lot of reminiscing, not based on our system or even based on Facebook, but in the day-to-day world. And so one way that might be really interesting to sort of tie those things together is to make really smooth bridges between online and offline kinds of reminiscing activity, right? Like that's what the Living Memory Box tried to do, right? They were trying to figure out a way to make it easy to, you know, integrate tangible objects into kind of a more digital reminiscing space. So I understand, all right? Like I said, I'm a little weird. Reminiscing was my problem for me, and so that's what I set out to solve. But there's definitely a bigger space around reminiscing. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you know. So this is basically the end of part one of the talk, right? That this is worth doing, right? Even the questions are like, oh, well, this is kind of interesting. It sure would be useful if we, you know, manage this reminiscing stuff. And in fact, Pensive, the system kind of died because, you know, the undergrads went away and the new grad students were interested in other projects, and I didn't want to like force them to code upon Pensive. But, you know, there's a system called Time Hop that's actually pretty beautiful that sort of reminds you, and it uses a very simple kind of context salience, right? What day of the year is it? 1 year ago today, you posted this status or this tweet or something, which is even that little bit of context is actually pretty interesting to people. And it's a fairly successful system. Ellen Isaacs at Park has, I think, a best paper coming out at Chi about a system that she built where you would take a picture. So this might also be more of a tie towards tangible things. You would take a picture of something, right, on your cell phone, and then a week and a month and 3 months and 6 months later, it would show it back to you and then encourage you to write about it and reflect both on it and the things you had written in the past to try to get you to sort of more and more deeply think about the things that had been important enough for you to capture, right? But this general idea, people want to reminisce more. People may want to reflect more, although the distance from reminiscing to reflection is fairly steep. You know, and that social media is an interesting tool and maybe a context for doing this in, right? I'll claim that's kind of a big win, right? So that's kind of the story that I leave off Pensive with. So brief break for questions, and then we'll jump into part 2 and part 3, which are shorter than part 1, thankfully. So, yes?
So, I mean, just reading your title says, how do people use social media to reflect? I wonder if you could explain to me a little bit the difference between reminiscing and reflecting. And, like, you said it's a steep, difference. And just what specifically is that difference?
So, okay, so I can't give you sort of book definitions of it. The way that I talk about it with people these days is that reminiscing is usually spontaneous and not necessarily purposeful, although it winds up serving a variety of goals. When I think of reflection, I think of it a little more towards the way Team Quantified Self does, where it's a specific activity with a specific purpose. So, you might want to reflect on, like Shun would talk about, the reflective designing practices, where you would sort of look at your design activities to try to think about, what are the properties of the situation? What do I know from the past? How can I sort of engage that into better design practice? And there was actually a really nice paper at Group last year, someone whose name I continually forget, which is really sad, but they were trying to develop a system to help doctors and nurses reflect on cases that they had, right? So reminiscing about those cases, well, you might flash back to something and think about it and talk about it with someone. Eli Mayfield?
Yeah.
I don't think that's the one I'm thinking of. No. It's someone else.
From similar, he did similar study. I was
Okay, fair enough. I'm actually thinking of a different paper at Group, though. I don't think this person was Eli. I think their name started with M. Yeah. I mean, Elijah was doing studies of pulling life events out of social media streams, right, and trying to identify those. And that was also a cool paper. There. He actually came by Cornell a couple weeks ago to chat to our breakfast series about some of that work. But this system was actually trying hard to, help doctors sort of understand across a set of cases, right? So more about generalizing. So I think reflection, right? And again, somebody who studies reflection, as kind of their bread and butter would pick my definition apart. But that it's this more structured, more organized, more sort of overview, knowledge building kind of activity, I think. Is that useful? I mean, yeah. Okay. So in chunk 2, I guess I'm going to talk about moving a little bit more towards not just reminiscent, but actually towards reflection here in the context of reflecting on relationships, and in particular close friendships. And this is work that was done by Victoria Sosik, who's a student at Cornell, and Shen Zhao, who is a student at Cornell, and I worked with them on this paper. And they were like, Pensa's really cool and all, but maybe we should understand what people would really use these data for if you didn't just stick it in their faces. And they realized, and they were interested in the social stuff, and so they realized that, in fact, Facebook has this interface that shows you the history of your relationship, right? See friendship. Now, of course, as we'll see, it doesn't show you the whole history of your relationship, but it does have, especially for someone with whom you use Facebook a lot, it has a fairly extensive record of things that you liked that the other person did, pictures you were tagged in together, things like that, right? That you might actually look at to say, what is it like when I hang out with my girlfriend, right? How do I interact with her? Do I interact with her in appropriate ways, right? And so you could imagine using social media data to think about friendships. And so we set out to see how people actually do that. And this paper is called See Friendship, Sort of. It was at CSCW last year. Basically what we did was we asked people to come to the lab, and we asked them to think about their relationships. And we asked either individuals or pairs to come in, and then to spend time thinking about either without or with their See Friendship page with this friend available to sort of support the conversation, right? Now, we didn't do all 4 conditions. We didn't do pairs, no data. That would be interesting, but that would also increase the number of subjects by 1/3, and the resources are finite. And so what we did was we had them do this task for like 5 to 10 minutes, and then we talked to them about how they had thought about it, right? And both during the task and more generally, right? Questions like, what does it mean to think about your friendship? When you reminisce, both during the task and in general, how did you do? What are the things that are important and salient to you? And in particular, if you use C friendship, why do you use it and how do you use it? And we video recorded and semi-structured and coded and affinity diagrammed and all the things that you do when you work with quantitative data. And there were lots of things to talk about, but the one that's most salient to this talk and this idea is that data supports and limits, right? That when you see this picture, it's easy to think of this moment, and it's hard to think about your relationship, right? When you see this picture, you think about this moment. When you remember this event, you remember things that happened there. And that the data makes it easy to tell stories about that thing. And this is something that's been found in other systems like this as well. It's like some of that conversation visualization stuff, like the Themail paper that Villegas and Golder and Donath did, that sort of sorted out your email archive by month, and then by frequent keywords, and then by the people you talk to a lot, right? People didn't, they were kind of interested in the patterns, but they often wound up sort of going back on these kind of needle and haystack searches where they would tell stories about particular incidents, right? And it turns out that this is not just data, right? If you're having a conversation with someone, it kind of does the same thing, right? You talk to them, and the story that they tell sort of focuses your attention on that. And it's hard, right, to break out of that to the bigger picture of their relationship. And further, it also, unless you're very comfortable with kind of the talk, right, it's hard to actually talk about, hey, is this friendship going well, or is this relationship going well, right? And this has implications for these kinds of systems where you're trying to, where people create data, where people use data, where you're trying to support people using data to think about their pasts, right? Because, if you have the wrong model, you're going to mostly fail. This is a system that a couple of undergrads, OJ, Zhao, and Tiffany Ng, built at Cornell a few years ago. This is called PyTime. PyTime takes your Gmail and your phone records, and not unlike that picture we saw earlier, aggregates them over time. This is a day of the week view, there's an hourly view, there's a by-month view. Or they chose a pi circle thing because of sort of, they had this kind of design rationale about pieces of a whole and kind of the circular flow of time, right? You could do a timeline, there are lots of ways you could represent it. But what they did was they presented these aggregations. And then for each slice, right, so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they would extract a couple of keywords that were kind of most characteristic of that slice versus other slices, right? And it turns out that if you ask people to use this and play with it, they are very confused by this until they can tell stories about what was going into those wedges, right? So people would look at these patterns and not understand what's going on at 7 p.m. Who cares, right? And they're, what's this about February? And then they would see a keyword like, oh, that's when my mom was in the hospital, and suddenly they're off and running telling stories again, right? But again, if your picture of how you should present data back to people as a quantified self person is graphs and charts, you've really got a problem. Because unless you give people some kind of guidance to get into those, right, it's just not gonna work. And you could imagine systems that do this, right, that work really hard to do this. So this is that view that I had before about somebody's exercise by day of week, by time of day, where things that glow brightly are high exercise times, right? One problem with this is that it probably doesn't tell this person anything they don't already know, right? Where's the insight? Right? That's a question of big data. But the other thing, right? Even if you could come up with patterns that weren't going to be obvious, you have to give people ways to connect to them. And so one kind of really promising strategy that I've heard people talking about in bits and pieces over various. So I mean, some of the people that you're going to be hanging out with actually, right? Hey, big data plus particular instances, right? Why not combine these sort of deep quantitative with thoughtful qualitative work to understand, or in this case, these are the marathons and triathlons that this person participated in, right? You could absolutely hook patterns to pretty, right? We could pay homage to Ben Schneiderman and details on demand and zooming through visualizations in ways that help people reflect and tell stories about what's going on, right? That, and as a student named Liz Murnane, who's at Cornell yesterday, I was chatting with her. She's like, oh, when people are doing these things, they're not just tracking, they're actually building an identity as an exerciser or as a bicyclist or as a non-smoker, right, or as a thin person. Why don't these systems help people build an identity and not just sort of show them data, right? This also works great for scientists who do big data research. This is a graph from a paper that I did with some other folks at Cornell. Dave Crandall was the lead author. I don't want to go too much into detail about the graph, but basically we were looking at how similar two editors were in Wikipedia based on the things that they worked on, right? So this is kind of a recommender systems intuition, right? If you like Hoop Dreams and you like Hoosiers, and I like Hoop Dreams and I like Hoosiers, then we're pretty similar, right? And so we looked at the overlap in their articles, and then we zero-centered it, the similarity measure that we used based on the first time they talked to each other, because in Wikipedia editors can talk to each other on their user pages. And what we found was that similarity kind of shoots up right before the first time two people talk to each other and then continues to grow after that. And we're like, well, that's cool. What's going on? And so we actually went in and looked at some moments of first contact. Right? We looked at the content of that, and we looked at what people had been up to, the 5 or 10 articles. It turns out that almost invariably, what's going on is that in Wikipedia, I talk to you because we happened to be working on an article together at the same time, and we didn't even know it. And then I did something, and then you did something, and I see what you did, and now I need to talk to you about it, either to thank you or to ask you why you did it, right? And so this is a story of how collaboration really happens between editors on Wikipedia. Yes, sometimes there are wiki projects that bring together large like-minded groups of people. Yes, there are featured article drives that take one article and get a bunch of people to put it together, but maybe most of the time, people are sort of interacting on Wikipedia. It's because of this kind of, instead of planning and then doing, right, they do and then repair in conversation. It was kind of a really interesting way to think about collaborating in Wikipedia that we wouldn't have seen just by looking at these, and we may not have picked on just by looking at people talking on their talk pages, right? We needed to see, oh, talk pages are related to article activity before we could ask that question. Right? Yes, sir?
Baseline?
Baseline is this is Jacquard similarity in set of article overlap, right? So these similarities are on average very low, right? This basically means that out of the set of 100 articles or so that we've edited, right, we overlap on 2 of them. 2.5 to 1.5, right? So it's sort of a rough measure of overlap in activity. And then the baseline is just 2 randomly chosen people, right? So 2 randomly chosen people have almost no similarity. That's the dotted line. So, yes?
By more edits, make you less similar?
You actually get more similar after the, I see what you mean. Okay, so I think there's just a mathematical property of the Jacquard similarity, right? Because it's basically the union over the intersection, right? And so, on average, so if you only have like 15 edits, right? If you have one article in common, it's going to shoot your similarity up to 0.06, right? So, yeah. All right.
You finished the part 2?
Yes.
Can I ask a question about part 2?
Okay.
So you talk about the pie chart, the first version of the design.
Uh-huh.
And so I wonder why it did not come up with the keywords combined with pie chart. Because that's very intuitive kind of design.
I mean, these are actually combined. They're just displayed in different places. The first version, we actually did not put the keywords because we were sure that people should focus on the patterns. We had an agenda in our design, right? In the same way that a lot of people, I think, have an agenda to say, you know, what's really important is understanding these sort of broader trends. And so we left them out, right? Ben Schneiderman would be like, you're idiots, and I would be like, you're right, Ben. But we deliberately did it. This is actually the third version, right? So, but the first version, we didn't have the keywords, and it was because of exactly this. We really wanted to try to avoid the storytelling that we had seen, you know, from the email paper and in some of our Penso stuff. So, yeah. All right. Do we have tolerance and time for part 3, or are we running out of gas? I'm happy to talk for as long as people want, but, you know, isn't everyone, right?
A few more minutes, and then we'll
okay.
take questions. So,
okay. All right. All right. Then part 3, really quickly. One thing that why it's C-friendship sort of is that there's lots of biases in what goes into Facebook data, right? You don't often put much of the mundane stuff. You may not put controversial or sad stuff, right? If you look at the text people post in Facebook and compare it to sort of normal corporate text, you find that there's much more shiny, happy language if you use kind of language analyzers like Pennebaker's Luke system, right? And so, you know, I mean, I guess this is already one thing to remember when you're doing this kind of big data work, right? There are some biases in the data, right? If you think back to that picture of tweets over time, right? You know, there were giant error bars for like Africa and very tiny error bars for like the US because not that many people use Twitter in Africa. And so if you want to say things about them, you should be careful, right? Because, you know, usage isn't distributed. This is stuff we probably already know, but it's useful to be reminded about that the stuff that goes into the social media data sausage, right, has some flies in it. So another thing that we found, though, was that in the first study, the C-friendship sort of paper, was that third parties played this incredibly big role in how you interpreted how your relationship was, right? You compared, you know, we weren't sociologists, right? We were more computer information scientists with some psychological background. Like a sociologist probably would have been like, well, duh. But we were like, oh, huh, that's kind of interesting, right? That these third parties actually, you know, sort of really influence and give you models and guides, right? And so Shen went off and took this to a study of romantic relationships and how people made decisions in Facebook to use various features of Facebook: relationship status, pictures, wall posts, come on brain, status, wall posts, relationship status, pictures. Yeah, those were the main 4 actually. And so again, we found some individuals and some couples to do the study, right? Individuals because they might be able to say more honest things without their partners. They're couples because we might want to see the dialectic of the interaction, right? That we might get something out of that. And then we asked them about the features, and this was a paper at CHI 2012, right? So I don't, and we are running out of time, so I don't want to say too many details about it, but I will say that people are sort of, you know, seeing 3 big things that happen, right? One is that people feel a lot of tensions. They feel tensions about their individual goals, tensions about their relationship goals, tensions about the expectations of their social networks, right? This is not necessarily quite the context collapse idea from Dana Boyd, although one of the things we found is that there's actually this sort of super duper context collapse where the 2 present networks come together and cause a lot of kind of chafing about what's appropriate behavior, right? Jock, athletic team, you know, kind of quiet girl with a few girlfriends, right? The kinds of things that you might want to post in those 2 venues are really quite different. So there were these tensions, and then there were features, right, that people exploited in unusual ways to manage these tensions, right? So for instance, maybe I would, you know, if my boyfriend needs me to sort of validate our relationship by putting it on Facebook, I'll do that. But I'll only make that visible to him, because I don't really want my third parties to be seeing me post about, because, you know, in our social circle, you don't talk about these things, and lovey-dovey public stuff is kind of, you know, public displays of affection are ew, right? And so they sort of, you know, use asymmetrical settings, asymmetrical behaviors. So maybe, you know, L would post pictures and boy of L would not post pictures, to sort of satisfy both the relational needs but the different expectations of the networks, right? And so if you think about it, and you know, I totally encourage you to read the paper, because it's kind of fun to read some of the stories about how people manipulate stuff, how people tag photos with their boyfriend to mark territory and property, right? Because if you're tagged in a picture with me, right, and we're sort of together, and you know, there's this notion, oh, you kind of belong to me, right? And people explicitly describe this as a strategy they use to manage relational tensions on Facebook. The highest level story, though, for, I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to skip that one too for time. The highest level story, though, is that the forces that cause people to make decisions about what they do in social media, and therefore the traces that they leave behind in social media, are actually really quite complicated, right? And there's a strong version of the big data story, which is we can throw away social science theory if we have enough data and enough statistics. The patterns will just emerge. We will see the relational dialectics bump in status posting behavior on Wednesdays at 9 o'clock. Right? And that story is just so full of shit, because, you know, there's you know, I mean, even machine learning people know, oh, by the way, whatever algorithm I use is going to sort of impart biases on the kinds of things that I'm going to be able to extract from the data, right? Well, you know, and then they, you know, some machine learning people think about the source of the data. I mean, we often don't, right? As machine learners, often the data comes in these nice, neat packaged data sets, and we don't sort of think about where they came from or how they got clean or anything. But if you're doing this kind of work, right, having some real sensitivity for the forces that are shaping what you're seeing might help you appropriately scope the claims that you make, choose better modeling techniques and algorithms that are more likely to find things that are out there, help you think about, you know, social science theories or insights that, although when I was a young lad, I totally made fun of sociologists because you know, people are messy, and what do those things explain, like 8% of variance? What can that tell me about the world? Until one day I realized people were like complicated and stuff. Using those things can actually help you think about maybe what features to bring in or additional data sets that you could merge with what you have to get deeper understanding. And so the stories of this talk are mostly about, right, yeah, they're about Facebook, and they're about relationships, and they're about reflecting, and they're about reminiscing. But they're also, you know, I guess the biggest story is about sort of being really careful and aware about the kinds of research you do, the kind of questions you ask, the kind of claims that you make around doing this stuff. I mean, I'm super sympathetic to all flavors of approaching scholarly inquiry. I'm a big fan of them. I've tried most of them, whether I know them well or not, and I work with people who know them better than I do, and that's something that we should probably all be thinking a little bit more about. So in the interest of time, I will stop there and take any questions while people don't like pass out and stuff. We'll give 15 seconds for all the hands to come up. Alrighty, bring it.
Two questions. So, regarding the forces driving reminiscence, so why are we reminiscing? And is it happening more, less than before? Is it something that social media kind of helps?
Okay. I don't know, because it's really hard to measure reminiscing, right? When we did our first study of people for the Pennsylvania system, we started the interview by saying, think about some time recently that you've reminisced. And people had an enormous amount of trouble
Reminiscing.
doing this. Yeah, exactly. And so people, I don't think are very attuned to how much they reminisce. If I had to guess, I'd say we do it less. And the reason why I'd say we do it less is the general argument that we spend more and more of our attention on activities. We have, people make this argument that with casual games and continuous awareness, you have very little time for echoes in the head stuff, right? That supports things like creativity and problem solving. I don't know that I believe that argument. I do know that I don't read as much as I used to. I don't talk to people face to face as much as I want to. And that's N of 1, right? Speaking of crappy ways to do scientific analysis, but if I had to say, I'd say that probably we reminisce on average less than we did before, right? I think the focus on the now also, right? I mean, you hear people talk about looking back at old Facebook content, right? And the thing you're never supposed to do is like a picture from 2 years ago, because that means you're a creepy stalker, right? And norms like that can come up, and they probably shape the ways that we really think about the past, right? So that's what I would say there.
A follow-up to the first, if the second is different, is why is it good? Why should we reminisce?
Why should we reminisce? Well, that is a good question, right? There's this sort of claim that reflection is good, right? But too much reflection can lead to paralysis. And Webster, the psych guy who's probably done the most studies of reminiscing, identifies some negative flavors of reminiscing too, right? You might reminisce to sort of escape the present moment. There's also the pleasantly named bitterness revival kind of reminiscing, in which we remember things in order to stay angry and hold grudges. So it's not you should be spending all your time reminiscing, right? Or even part of your time. But it does have real benefits to people, right? Now, how much you should be doing that versus how much you should be checking your Facebook versus how much you should be writing a paper versus, or with SuggestBot, how much should you be editing Wikipedia, right? Implicitly, the answer with SuggestBot is more! And the other kind of more. And so, sorry, I know you never hear that. I feel so stupid now. I'm going to leave. So this is a values question, right? What I think is
I don't know if it's a values question because you didn't say, you said it's beneficial, but for what are the outcomes?
Okay. So on balance, if you look at this, people tend to feel a stronger connection to other people, and they, if you do this kind of, especially they've studied this mostly in the elderly, right? The outcomes that there's there's this notion of life review, which is a more structured kind of reminiscing that gets closer to reflection on your life as a thing, and it sort of makes people more accepting of the things that have happened in their past, more comfortable with themselves, right? So sort of psychological well-being kind of outcomes. Right. All right, question 2.
So did you think about reminiscing as a society, at a higher level, not just as a group?
Right. So I would probably use the term cultural heritage for that, and I think Sophie Lau is interested in that. She graduated from Colorado. Phoebe Sangers is pretty interested in this. She did some studies of visiting / studying a sort of remote cities in Newfoundland, and sort of thinking about how change is affecting them and how to help them both tell their stories and make appropriate choices about change, which when you hear that you think, oh, like the Amish. But there's, seriously, like the Amish, right? Sort of making sort of careful, thoughtful choices about technology. There's a guy named Maurice Malvena who has done some reminiscing work in Ireland who's trying to chronicle the Irish Troubles as kind of a cultural story. I haven't thought about it much myself, right? So I'd have to mostly point you to those folks, but I think it's something that's interesting, and that, especially, there's this it'd be an interesting kind of general thing for Chi to think about, right? Because we have plenty of anthropologists who play in the Chi space, right? Who are sort of there and studying context and telling stories about that and really kind of understanding what's going on in technology context, right? But there'd be kind of a meta level, which is, well, what kinds of things might we want to observe down the road? Right? People started talking about things like, virtual ethnographies and things like that, trying to think about this. But that's kind of the direction I would go if I knew more enough to answer your question. Fair? Okay, cool.
Okay, so what you pointed out with Pensive and other sort of research that used memories aggregated together from social media were more interpersonal relationship or like self-reflective stuff. Now, people also share other things in social network sites, like their political views, media preferences, so on and so forth, that change over time. So do you think reminiscing of one's past, say, political opinions before elections come or other like, decision points come would likely influence the outcome of their voting behavior or other behavior? So, for instance, I come from a country that keeps voting for the same awful prime minister over and over again every time.
I mean, like every country.
Yeah, like every country. And then they say, oh, he's so awful, and like 4 years later he gets
Cha-ching, yeah.
elected again. And then I think there's sort of like a memory loss on a society basis that leads to that kind of decision making. Now, I'm wondering if this would change if you would say, look, 3 years ago you said this guy really, really sucked.
That's interesting. I don't know. I think the incumbent advantage is largely about publicity and exposure and priming and salience, right? I don't really know. Again, now I'm stepping towards political science, which is something I don't actually study and know. But we can speculate. And so I think. This would be kind of like bitterness revival for the political parties, right? And then. The attack ads, right, are, I guess, kind of like that, right? They're sort of helping people remember, oh, so-and-so is so bad, right? But not personally in the way that you say. And not like through networks, right? There's no kind of network effect where you talk to Nir, talks to Roz, talks to Jeremy, right? And so the opinions kind of propagate down to... down through the network, which, a lot of the people who I think study kind of political movements think about sort of this network perspective as the thing that really, at least the Arab Spring people are sort of really kind of focusing on that as a mechanism. But yeah, reminding people that, would be pretty interesting. So I'm going to show you about this one.
Remind me to discuss that later. I think there are ideas from political psychology that could be relevant.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a CSCW panel on filter bubbles and sort of exposure to only certain kinds of information that might also be related.
So I was thinking, the saying goes like the first step to solving a problem is being aware of a problem. And I know it's not necessarily about behavior change, but if you can take those bad memories, that bad information, that past previous behaviors that a person has had, and kind of spit it back at them and say like, look, this is your bad previous history. Reflect on it and maybe add that to your behavior change. But you mentioned this idea of reminiscing and how that's different from reflecting and reminiscing.
Technically, Charlie mentioned that, but
yeah. Little purpose, little purpose, and then making it very purposeful. Do you have some ideas in terms of how to take something that has little purpose, the reflecting, the reminiscing that's spontaneous, and actually making it purposeful, actually making it with a goal in mind?
Right. So a couple of answers to that. They're probably not going to be so satisfying, right? One is that you probably could by choosing the content and the form and timing of the reflection. So someone in the web, this is, my ability to mostly remember the names is the extent of it, right? But someone was talking about looking basically at sort of teachable moments, right? Teachable moments when you can change. It was you, Nir, change individuals' behavior, right? And so if you could model that, and then time reminiscing activities appropriately. That would be one answer to that. A second answer is that, we kind of get taught to reminisce by mom mostly, is the literature that I've seen on. I haven't looked at all the literature, but, we sort of learn to reminisce as kids, right? Hey, what did you do in school today, right? And then maybe mom will tell stories about things that kid had talked about in the past, right? And so if I were going to go after that, I might think about, reminiscing as kind of in a sort of social group, or maybe in a technology that sort of tried to aggregate reminiscing behavior together more than Pensive did with just like a sort of diary, more like Ellen Isaac's stuff, actually, that paper that I mentioned earlier. You know, appropriate structures for connecting bits of reminiscing together into larger pictures might be a strategy that I would use to think about that. I mean, the third thing is that, you know, when you talked about this, it made me think of like Pennebaker's stuff, right? The expressive writing paradigm, right? Where you write about your past as a way to come to manage it and understand it and get over it, like I should probably do like with my dad, right? And so you might think about that as kind of one possible general. I mean, Victoria Sosik, the one who did the Let Out on the Sea Friendship sort of paper, is trying to think about how to take positive psychology exercises and use social media both as a sort of information resource and as a platform for doing, you know, reminding people, making these exercises more effective, maybe adding explicit social elements to them. That would be another approach. So, you know, I don't really know, right? But there you go.
One last.
Well, you've had a couple. You have not. Sorry, man. You can ask me after.
Okay. Okay, so I really like the overarching argument of looking at big data with sensitivity and carefulness. And
well, when you say it like that, it sounds really obvious, but that's okay, right? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and what I was thinking about your presentation is that the idea of like, do you think reminiscing, does social media favor certain moments to reminisce? So are there moments that are outside of social media that are not not documented, and then social media will only encourage us to reminisce over the moments that are documented?
Yeah, this is a little version of the, almost a version of the filter bubble argument, right? This is the argument that, once you get into a system and it knows something about your preferences, like a news system or a recommender system, has a tendency, unless they think about it very carefully in the algorithm, to give you more and more of the same, right? And so you wind up, the argument is that you wind up detached from other points of view or other kinds of data about the world, right? And it would be pretty easy to draw an analogy to what you say, right? Here, the thing that's pressing you is the fact that some data is available for later use and others isn't. And so if a system is going to show you data, of course it's going to, I think you're right, favor the things that are captured. Again, this is a kind of story where as a designer, you would want to pay careful attention to what's not captured and think about what's important. But again, this is again starts to sound like HCI 101, right? That you need to sort of look at what's, I mean, this is actually a version of telling this story, right? You need to look at what's not in your data. So Wikipedia researchers, A, they study Wikipedia and they claim they understand collaboration, and B, they study the edit log, right? But, they don't see the IRC channels and the meetups and the emails, and they usually only look at article space, and so they miss all the other kinds of interaction that goes on Wikipedia, right? And so it is true that, the stuff that you choose as your material is going to shape the kind of art that you can do, right? And there's just no way around it. So I guess my answer to your question is you're right. There. All right, Moore said we're done, so but I'm happy hanging out. Thanks. Social reflex was so strong I almost started crying.